Professor Corey introduced a new twist on exports, and that was tourism as an export. And the concept is that you sell your product to the world. Your product is tourism, your local tourism. And rather than shipping your product out to the world comes to you to gain possession of what they've purchased from you. In other words, a hyper-local experience. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Professor Corey.
I want to very quickly go through a large number of photos that are actually in the book. And I thought that was a useful way to start because I'd like you to experience the place. So this is a person-sized statue on Fogo Island, and it's a statue of the great auk, A-U-K. And the great auk has been extinct since the early part of the 19th century. And extinction is an underlying theme of a lot of what goes on in Fogo Island and Newfoundland, and frankly in much of today's global environment. So it's an issue that permeates a great deal. And then of course in the distance is a fishing trawler that is iconic of the fishery industry, which Fogo Island and much of Newfoundland has it's been so important to its development over a long period of time. This is the small town of Jobat's Arm, where the Fogo Island Inn, you will see in a few moments, is located. In the upper left-hand corner is a sort of a horizontal black dot on the other side of the water there. That's one of the studios we will show you a little bit later. This island is actually, in the region we're concerned with for planning, is actually the big island to the right and that sinuous island to the left, Change Island. Probably no more than 3,000 residents live in this region, and about 300 live over in Change Island, the rest on Fogo Island. If you haven't seen a cod up close, that is the beauty. That is a cod. And there are several cod there. In the old days, they were gigantic. You'll see that in a moment. Nowadays, they're a little bit more in this size range. This is a cinema built into this remarkable hotel called the Fogo Island Inn. Here is a man who had made his living in making boats, small rowboats, scaled boats, and now, in addition to that, is working up special furniture that manifests the local artist and cultural dimensions. This is a typical room in Fogo Island Inn. There are only a total of 29 rooms, and the notion is to keep it small scale so that it is sustainable, that is the inn, over a long period of time and has a small footprint. There are a couple of suites that are several stories and accommodate a few more individuals, but on the whole it's a very small footprint, and this is a very pricey, high-end place to stay. That also is part of the sustainability. The notion is bring in tourists, but tourists who can help pay for the development ultimately of the island and not to overwhelm the island's ecology. So this is one of the rooms. Every room has a view of the ocean. And those quilts, for example, were all made and commissioned locally, principally from the wives of the fishermen. This is the dining room. Only 35 people can really be accommodated there. Again, intentionally small and compact. Food is all local sourced, either from Newfoundland or from the island itself during growing seasons. High-end dining. The man on the right is the executive chef. He happens to be a Newfoundlander, so he is very much engaged in fusion of various kinds, but fusion not say of European and Asian food, but fusion of modern Newfoundland food, all in historical or contemporary terms connected to the culture of Newfoundland and Fogo Island. The individual on the left is part of the Halloween-like celebrations that are held at Christmas, and people dress up and they come and knock on neighbors' doors and actually get small gifts, quite analogous to Halloween. He is a mummer, referred to as a mummer. And that's a tradition that was brought over originally from the West Country of England and Ireland. This is one of the spin-offs, actually, a small restaurant. Again, really high-quality food, spun off from the planning and the thinking, serving as kind of a model to see, would this high-end approach to tourism work on this island? There's some of the local gardening that provides the food for the high-end restaurant, Fogo Island restaurant, some of the produce. There is the bar of the Fogo Island Inn. Now, I'm going to show you quickly 4 artist studios. This is the long studio. That's actually the one I pointed out to you before across the water. I'll tell you more about the studios in a moment. Right now, I'd like you to sit back and enjoy the architecture, the modern architecture. This is the Tower studio. And this tiny studio is a takeoff on some of the fishery structures that come out of the history of preparing the cod for shipment. But it actually is a small artist studio. This is the Squish studio. And this is the Squish studio in the winter, and I love the shot because it's got not only the far sea, the surf, but an iceberg, and then growlers in the surf up close, pieces of ice that have partially melted and broken up, and that's of course Squish in a nicer time of the year weather-wise. This is a refurbished old house, original house, that is available close by to the studio for artists who have won fellowships to come and spend maybe up to a year, maybe a few weeks, maybe a semester as artists of various kinds. Now, think widely in terms of art. It might be a painter or a sculptor, but it might be a poet, might be a novelist, performance art of various kinds. But they might live there and then walk to one of the nearby studios. That's a distant shot of the Fogo Island Inn, the 29-room or suite inn. Again, modern architecture. You'll notice the modern architecture keys off again the fishing structure. So the stilts that are angular were built to accommodate the angular rock surface upon which such structures had to be built. So they both were stable and could take care of vertical changes in the topography. Another view, same building. These are all just to give you a sense of the way the thing was designed. This is a church which has been repurposed. It's now for performance art, plays of various kinds by the community. This is it's fascinating. How many hotels do you go to where there is a library right off the main foyer? And that's what this is. And it's the collection of the man, Leslie Harris, who had passed away, and he was the president of the only university in Newfoundland, Memorial University, and that's his former collection on the local area. And he had kept a small house in Fogo Island, so there's a lot of Fogo-specific material there, and guests of the hotel can come in and go through these materials and learn a bit about the locality, which is really one of the unique attraction points to learn about this unique culture. Again, very pleasant area. This is one of the mummers up close. These are all handmade kinds of costumes with like a paper bag and eye holes. And the tradition would be to come and meet each other's neighbor during the time when the winter was really just starting to pick up. Otherwise, you would stay kind of huddled in your house. But this was a way around Christmas time to come out and meet the neighbors. And the neighbors were supposed to guess who you were. And therefore they covered themselves up like that, and they would get small gifts and give small gifts. So very Halloween-like in many ways. This is Gordon Slade, and he is the chair of the board of the Shorefast Foundation. This is the entity that's taken the lead in developing this small island. And he had served in various governmental and private sector capacities over his career. And he has a particular interest in the oceans and all the ecological issues involved. And his principal concern is, can we use the oceans sustainably and still maintain healthy ocean ecological environments? And so he's devoted much of the latter part of his career to those issues. But he's the chair of the board. In a moment, you'll see the woman who is really the dynamo of this whole concept of the Shorefast Foundation. She is one of the wealthier women in North America. She made her wealth principally in a Silicon Valley corporate environment, and she is a native of Fogo Island. She was raised in a family with, I think she had 6 brothers. She was the only girl. The family, Ma and Pa, were illiterate. They were fisher persons, and they lived in a home that had no running water, had no indoor toilet, and no electricity. So that's the environment she grew up with. She was so smart. She won a national scholarship to go off island, and she then went to university at Carleton University in Ottawa, took a business course, and became one of the most successful and prominent businesswomen in certainly Canada, but in fact North America. She cashed out her holdings in the company when she was still in her late 40s. And she decided ultimately, now she's a daughter of a fisherman, so she was a real sailor and knew and loved sailing. So she sailed around the world several times, and she decided, after doing philanthropic work in Africa, because she was taken by the culture, here she was doing these good things around the world, and she said, I need to go back home to the culture I really know and devote my philanthropic skills and talents, because she's quite innovative, to my home place. So she has come back to Fogo Island, created the Shorefast Foundation, and it's at its core an empowerment for economic development of that island, including Change Island. This is one of the more modern cod pots I alluded to. It's helpful because it doesn't drag the sea bottom and destroy that bottom and bring in lots of other fish that really aren't targeted for catching. In this case, the target fish is cod. And those cost about $1,000 a piece. So to get the fishermen to use those in the kind of financial environment that they must do their business has been part of one of the major challenges she's had. So some of the pots are as gifts in the early stages, but at some point the notion is, might we get to the point where the pots could be bought not only by local fishermen, but maybe cod fisher persons in other locations as well. Today, one of the geotouristic, we'll say more about that later, attractions is a tourist can get on one of these fishing trawlers, go out, look at the islands nearby where a lot of the bird life is absolutely stunning, and of course take a closer look at some of the icebergs that are available there. I end my visual presentation that I wanted to show you with a chair which was made by that fellow that you saw making the small rowboat. And so the chair is made of wood that was not bent only by persons, but was bent by nature. They would go out and forage that wood into the brush because there aren't really a lot of numbers of trees, but small stunted vegetation that has natural curves in it. So these are costly pieces of furniture, but once you've been there, and if you have the wealth to be able to stay at the inn, you might very well want to have these kinds of furniture in your office and so on. But they're really works of art as well as, of course, craft. Now, little context and background first. Fogo Island is basically barren, windswept islands that projects into the North Atlantic. The Change Island is a little over 10 square miles, where the large island itself of Fogo is 110 square miles. About 2,700 people live on Fogo itself and about 300 over on the Change Island. Each of the little fishing villages are referred to as outports. And in Newfoundland, road development over its history was very scattershot, really not a key thing, because if you moved from place to place, you moved by boat from one port to the next. That was the general mode until much more modern times. The fishing economy is that. Without the fish, not much of an economy. And one of the public policy endeavors in the 1950s and 1960s was because the government at that time, the provincial government at that time, saw this setup of relying 100% on fishery as not really sustainable. So they said, let's do an industrialization strategy and try to bring folks out of those ports and concentrate them in locations inland where industrial activity could occur. So there were three major attempts over about a 2-decade period to move people, relocate them to those kinds of locations away from the coast. Not hugely successful. But the good news is that, I think, failed policy created strength, independence, and bootstrapping kind of thought process and philosophy out on some parts of the island. And Fogo Island was one of those where the folks said, look, we've had enough of those kind of policies. We're going to largely do this ourselves. Crank the time machine up. We're at 1992. The cod fishing stocks basically collapsed. And so the federal government of Canada and also the US federal government put in various moratoria dealing with cod fishing. The Canadian moratorium is still in effect to this day. The cod stocks are coming back ever so slowly and smallly at this point, but not enough to sustain commercial fishing. So families can go out and do a little fishing for the family, but not much beyond that at this stage. The photo on the left shows a small child and gives you a sense of some of the larger cod in the latter part of the 19th century that were available. The poor little chap over here on the right, he probably had something like a minnow for his codfish. He didn't have a great deal. And what was the collapse, what was a primary cause, certainly not the only one, that was industrial-sized fishing ships came in and just sucked up cod by the millions and just kept doing that to the point where the nearby native stocks were almost totally completed. In order to allow the stocks to have a chance at revival, the moratorium on commercial fishing was put in place in 1992. As I say, it's still in place on a truly commercial basis. Now, I'm segueing up to much more modern times now into this century when Zita Cobb is coming back from her philanthropic activities in other parts of the world and is now focused on her own community. A couple of concepts she has adopted, one from the National Geographic, she calls it, and they call it, geotourism. The notion is principally if you're interested in using tourism as a development tool locally, then focus on whatever unique characteristics nature-wise, societally, that you have locally, and look at those as the assets you might want to invest in and tout beyond your borders to bring people in or through short-term kinds of business that bring in income. One element of geotourism, of course, is around food. And the Traverse City area, for example, has done, I think, a very good job along those lines the last decade or two. But eco-dining then becomes a very important, but certainly not the only tactic that helps promote geotourism. Now, there are a number of challenges with all the relatively good and exciting things I've ticked off for you, just in pragmatic terms. One is that Fogo Island is an island, and it is in a very harsh kind of environment. So the past couple of winters have been very difficult. For example, the old, and that's the current ferry, but then a new one's coming online this upcoming fall of this year in 2015. But the old ferry would have a tough time during some of the winter sea ice events that would occur that would be so strong it would even take out the electrical cables and therefore some of the internet connections and all the rest. And the capacity of the old ferry was relatively small, so that if you had a dentist appointment on the mainland, you may miss that a couple of times because you couldn't get on the ferry because maybe of long tractor trailers that were taking up huge amounts of space on the ferry, and there you are in your little truck or your little vehicle, and you have no space to get on, and of course the commercial drivers have a priority. So there's been a lot of difficulty just getting people on and off the island throughout the 12-month cycle. Other dimensions are, now CEDA is trying to attract this high-end geotourist and trying to do it year-round if at all possible. And so air connections are essential. Right now there is an airstrip, but it's used principally in case there's a medical emergency. So there's not a regular commercial service at all. So the Shorefest Foundation has been working with the province intensely to try to get the airstrip upgraded, and they've been instrumental in getting the new ferry service coming in. Now, I've given you a lot of different dimensions. Let's pull it together and organize it a little bit programmatically, as we development planner types are often used to doing. These are the activities, the bundle of economic development initiatives that the Shorefest Foundation has been pushing over the last several years. First, Fogo Island Arts. This is the program I mentioned that the artists in residence get these fellowships under competition, and they come literally from all over the world to work in those studios, and then they will produce their products. I'm using business language, but that's really in a way what they are, in various ways, so that the community can learn about those artistic outcomes. They can attend gallery presentations, because there's an art gallery built into the inn, and there can be exchange between local artists and would-be artists and the outsiders who come in, some for a whole year, some for a semester, some for few-week assignments. And so that exchange mechanism has been working reasonably well, very much though at the individual face-to-face kind of level. We're not talking about mass education here. Another element is a microfinance fund. One of CEDA's colleagues from the Silicon Valley corporate experience gave her $1 million, or the foundation, $1 million just for that purpose, to see if there was a possibility of spinning off and creating small and medium-sized enterprises on the island itself. Now, I had mentioned the familyness of the fishery history. Well, some of the women in particular were targeted as some of the would-be business persons because the men were still going out and bringing in the fish during some parts of the season. So a number of the small enterprises that already have been created were by mom and maybe an older daughter, or mom and her sister, but a lot of very female-led business activities. The Fogo Island Inn is seen by CEDA and the foundation as probably the engine, if you had to look at a principal driver for the economic development activities. Again, what's its strategy? To attract wealthy globals, so-called geotourists, to visit the local area, and the net profits would flow inward, that is, to the people of the island. They're now in their third year of operation. The first year did not produce a surplus, an economic surplus. The second and third years are, and the projections and trajectory of the projections is for continued growth that they had planned for. So therefore, this last year has then been involved setting up, okay, what institution could we create to allow the community to use its assets that it is getting for its own economic development, how to set their own priorities and so on. So the local government I alluded to in 2010 got created. It's a partner in that decision-making process, but so is the cooperative of the fishing processing and the fishermen, and so are people, regular folk, householders, and so are some of the businesses now that are starting to be created as a result of the microfinance fund. So we're looking at an endeavor all in process, not set at all at this moment in time, still developing, still learning day by day, season by season, because seasons are so crucial in this area. Looking at those programs, trajecting off a bit into the future, I think these are the three lessons that I have taken away from the research we've done. The first one is the fact that too often, based on experiences we've had in Michigan, but elsewhere as we've done our work, is there has not been an embracing of the global economy. The economy is a very different beast this century, but let's say this decade, than it was even the last decade. And it's much more interconnected, it's much more networked. We haven't really said, okay, what does this mean locally as I look around and look at all the possibilities? In other words, not say, oh, globalism, bad. Yeah, there are bad and tough things to deal with, but looking at it and say, what opportunity could my unique local set of assets be mobilized to accomplish? Therefore, that leads to the second point, I would say, and that is try to look and understand your locality in a way that says, what are my local advantages, if any, that I could capitalize in terms of an economic development strategy? And looking wide-rangingly, culture, nature, art, architecture, heritage, items I don't even have listed here that would be unique to your locality. And then lastly, CEDA basically, and I mean she's really strong on this, she will not, for example, source the inn and buy from entities that are terribly exploitative. And so she pays a great deal of attention to that. And some parts of the world she will not touch any products from, for example. And so doing good with business, social business then, is sort of the last key concept here, that she is really spending a great deal of her time now going around Canada and literally the world, because she participates in some of those Fogo Island dialogues, trying to get other entrepreneurs and business persons to think much more in those terms. That if you're doing business in localities, you really owe that locality something in return. Not only the employees, but the community of which that business is part, its ecology.